There's something almost invisible happening beneath the surface of every connection with someone who pulls away, something most people never fully understand. It's easy to assume they don't care. Easy to label them as distant, cold, or incapable of real love. But that assumption misses something deeper, something much more precise. Because the truth is, they do care. Just not in the way most people expect. And more importantly, they don't value what most people try to offer them. They're not moved by constant reassurance. They don't feel closer because of endless texting or emotional intensity. In fact, the very things that are supposed to bring people closer often make them slowly step back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, subtly, until one day you realize something has shifted and you don't know exactly when it happened. What makes this even more confusing is that you can be doing everything right. Showing up, being available, expressing your feelings, trying to build something real, and yet it still feels like you're losing them. Not because you're not enough, but because what they value isn't obvious. It's rare. So rare that almost no one naturally embodies it without even realizing it. And that's where everything changes. Because when someone finally carries those rare qualities, something inside them softens in a way that doesn't feel forced. They don't feel trapped. They don't feel pressured. They don't feel like they're slowly losing control over themselves. Instead, they feel something unfamiliar, but safe enough not to run from. And that's the moment where distance starts turning into curiosity. Most people never see this shift coming. They just feel it. The subtle way attention lingers a little longer, the way silence doesn't feel like disconnection anymore, the way presence becomes enough without needing to constantly prove anything. And yet, this isn't something you can fake. It's not a technique, it's not a strategy, it's something deeper, something that changes the entire energy of how you show up. The biggest misunderstanding is thinking that they don't value connection, that they're wired to avoid love entirely. But that's not true. They just don't trust what feels overwhelming. They don't trust what feels like it's going to take something away from them. And most forms of love unintentionally do exactly that. Because most people love in a way that seeks closeness by increasing intensity, more communication, more reassurance, more emotional expression. But to someone who is constantly aware of their own need for space, that kind of closeness doesn't feel like connection. It feels like pressure building slowly in the background. Not because it's wrong, but because it's too much, too fast, too consuming. So they pull back, not always consciously, not always with clear reasoning. Sometimes they don't even understand why they feel the need to create distance. They just know that something inside them starts tightening, that their sense of calm begins to fade, that the connection, instead of feeling safe, starts to feel like something they might lose themselves in, and that's what they're protecting. It's not that they don't want you, it's that they don't want to disappear inside something they can't control. So when someone comes along and interacts with them in the same way everyone else does, even if it's loving, even if it's genuine, it still triggers that same quiet resistance, that same instinct to step back just enough to breathe again. And this is where most connections begin to fall apart. Because the more distance they create, the more the other person tries to close that gap. The more they reach out, the more they seek reassurance, the more they try to understand what's going wrong. And without realizing it, they create exactly the environment that pushes them even further away. It becomes a cycle. One person trying harder, the other pulling back more. Until eventually it feels like there's no balance left. But what almost no one realizes is that there's a completely different way of being, one that doesn't trigger that cycle at all. One that doesn't create pressure, doesn't demand constant closeness, doesn't make them feel like they have to protect themselves from the connection itself. And that way of being is built on something rare, not loud. Not obvious, not something you can easily point to, but something they recognize instantly, even if they can't explain it. It's a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that most people struggle to embody, not because they're incapable, but because it goes against what they've been taught love is supposed to look like. Because most people believe that loving someone means needing them, expressing everything, sharing constantly, closing every gap as soon as it appears. But to someone who values space as much as connection, that kind of love feels overwhelming. So when they encounter someone who feels deeply but doesn't depend heavily, it stands out in a way that's almost disarming. There's no pressure to respond immediately, no emotional weight behind every interaction, no sense that they're responsible for maintaining the other person's emotional stability, and that changes everything. Because for the first time, they don't feel like they have to manage the connection. They don't feel like they have to constantly adjust themselves to avoid hurting someone. They don't feel like their natural need for space is going to create conflict. Instead, they feel something unfamiliar, ease. And that ease allows them to stay. Not because they're being held there, but because they don't feel the need to leave. This kind of presence doesn't chase when there's distance, it doesn't panic when there's silence, it doesn't interpret every shift as something negative that needs to be fixed immediately. It simply remains steady, grounded, unshaken by the small fluctuations that usually create tension. And that steadiness becomes something they start to trust. Because it doesn't demand anything from them. It doesn't require them to be more open than they're ready to be. It doesn't push them into conversations they haven't processed internally yet. It doesn't make them feel like they're constantly being observed or evaluated. It just exists in a way that feels calm instead of consuming. And that calmness creates space. Not distance, but real space. The kind that allows them to slowly move closer without feeling like they're losing control. The kind that lets them process their own emotions without external pressure. The kind that makes connection feel like something they can step into instead of something they need to escape from. But most people don't operate this way. When faced with uncertainty, they react, they reach, they try to close the gap as quickly as possible because distance feels uncomfortable, silence feels like rejection, and naturally they want to fix that feeling. So they text more, ask more questions, try to create clarity, and without realizing it, they turn something that could have unfolded naturally into something that feels forced. That's when the shift happens again. The quiet pulling back, the subtle change in energy, the sense that something is no longer flowing the way it did before. And it's not because the connection wasn't real. It's because the environment changed from something that felt open to something that felt heavy. And the more that heaviness builds, the more they retreat into themselves, not to hurt you, not to disconnect completely, but to regain that sense of internal balance they're always trying to protect. And unless something changes in how that connection feels, the distance keeps growing. Not dramatically, but steadily, until it becomes the new normal. And that's why these rare qualities matter so much. Because they don't just attract, they sustain. They create a kind of connection that doesn't trigger the instinct to pull away. A kind of presence that feels safe without being overwhelming. A kind of emotional energy that doesn't demand, but invites. And when that invitation is felt, something inside them begins to shift, slowly, quietly, but in a way that changes everything that follows. And when that quiet shift begins, it doesn't announce itself in obvious ways. It's not a sudden transformation where everything becomes clear and expressive overnight. It's much more subtle than that, almost unnoticeable if you're not paying close attention. But if you are, you start to feel it in the smallest moments. A response that comes a little quicker than before, a message that feels slightly more open, a presence that lingers just a bit longer instead of pulling away at the first sign of closeness. These aren't grand gestures, they're not dramatic declarations. But for someone who is used to holding distance, these small movements mean everything. And they don't happen because they were pushed. They happen because something about the connection feels different now. There's no pressure sitting underneath it. No expectation waiting to be fulfilled. No silent demand for them to show up in a way they're not ready for. And because of that, they begin to relax. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to stay a little longer than they usually would. Enough to explore the connection instead of instinctively stepping away from it. This is the effect of emotional self-sufficiency when it's real. Not when it's forced, not when it's used as a strategy to appear distant or detached, but when it's genuinely a part of how you exist within yourself. Because there's a difference between acting like you don't need anything and actually being grounded enough that your emotional state isn't constantly dependent on someone else's behavior. And they can feel that difference instantly. If it's an act, it eventually reveals itself. In moments of inconsistency, in subtle shifts where calm turns into anxiety, where patience turns into frustration, where space is given, but not without an underlying tension. But when it's real, it doesn't fluctuate like that. It remains steady. You don't chase when they pull back, not because you're trying to prove something, but because you don't feel the urge to. You don't spiral into overthinking every pause in communication. You don't interpret silence as rejection that needs to be fixed immediately. Instead, you stay centered. You allow the connection to breathe, and that breathing room becomes something they start to rely on, even if they never say it out loud. Because for once, they're not in a dynamic where they feel responsible for someone else's emotional state. They're not walking on that subtle edge where one wrong move might create tension or disappointment. They're not constantly aware of the need to respond, reassure, or explain themselves. They're just allowed to be. And that's rare. So rare that it catches them off guard. Because most connections they've experienced follow a pattern, a rhythm that eventually becomes predictable. It starts with interest, builds into closeness, and then slowly turns into something heavier, something that requires more from them than they feel comfortable giving. And when that shift happens, they retreat. Not out of lack of care, but out of a need to restore balance within themselves. But when that pattern is interrupted, when the connection doesn't follow that familiar path, they don't feel that same need to escape. Instead, they feel something unfamiliar. Curiosity. A quiet pull towards something that doesn't feel overwhelming. And that curiosity is what keeps them there. It's what makes them check their phone again, even when they weren't planning to. It's what makes them think about the interaction long after it's over. It's what creates that subtle shift where distance starts turning into interest again, but this time without pressure attached to it. And that's where most people misunderstand what's actually happening. They think effort is what creates attraction, that doing more, showing more, expressing more will naturally bring someone closer. But with someone who is sensitive to emotional pressure, effort alone doesn't create closeness. Energy does. The energy of how you show up, the absence of neediness, the presence of calm, the ability to stay connected without trying to control the outcome. And when that energy is consistent, it begins to change how they experience the connection itself. They stop associating closeness with pressure. They stop anticipating that familiar shift where things become too much. They stop preparing themselves to pull away because there's nothing pushing them in that direction anymore. And this is where something even deeper begins to form. A sense of trust, not built through words, but through experience. Because trust for them isn't created by promises or constant communication, it's created by how safe they feel existing within the connection. And safety, in this case, doesn't come from intensity. It comes from emotional space, from knowing they can step back without losing everything, from feeling like their pace is respected without being questioned, from experiencing connection that doesn't demand more than they're ready to give. And when that kind of safety is present, they start to open in ways they usually don't. Not all at once, but gradually. They share a little more, stay a little longer, engage a little deeper, and it doesn't feel forced, it feels natural. But here's where most people unknowingly break this. They start noticing the shift, and they react to it. They see the increased attention, the slightly deeper engagement, the subtle signs of closeness, and they interpret it as a signal to move things forward faster, to ask more questions, to seek clarity, to define what's happening. And in doing that, they unintentionally reintroduce pressure into something that was unfolding naturally. Because for someone who processes emotions internally, being asked to explain what they feel before they fully understand it themselves creates tension. It makes them aware of something they weren't ready to define yet. And that awareness, that sudden focus on what is this or where is this going, shifts the energy again. From something that felt open to something that feels like it needs to be figured out. And that's when the hesitation returns. The slight pause before responding, the subtle pullback in engagement, the feeling that something has changed, even if nothing obvious was said. And it's not because they lost interest. It's because the connection started to feel like something they might have to manage again, something that might require more from them than they're comfortable giving. And so they create space, not as a rejection, but as a way to regain that internal balance. This is why non-intrusive understanding is so rare and so deeply valued, because it allows the connection to exist without constant evaluation, without the need to define every stage, without turning every moment of closeness into something that needs to be analyzed or secured. It's the ability to understand without needing immediate clarity, to trust the process without forcing direction, to allow silence without assuming disconnection. And when someone embodies that, it changes everything. Because now they're not just experiencing connection. They're experiencing freedom within connection. And that's something they don't walk away from easily. Because for once, they don't feel like they have to choose between being close to someone and being true to themselves. They can have both. And that realization, even if it happens quietly, is what makes them stay. And when they begin to feel that they don't have to choose, something inside them softens in a way that's almost unfamiliar to them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet release of tension they didn't even realize they were holding. Because for so long, connection has felt like something that comes with a cost. A slow trade between closeness and independence. The closer things get, the more they feel like they might lose parts of themselves. Their space, their pace, their internal world that they've learned to protect so carefully. So even when they want connection, there's always that underlying awareness, that subtle voice reminding them not to go too far, not to get too comfortable, not to fully let their guard down. But now, that voice starts to fade. Not completely, but enough for them to stay present a little longer without feeling the need to retreat. enough for them to engage without constantly monitoring how close things are getting, enough for them to experience connection without preparing an exit in the background. And that shift doesn't come from being convinced. It comes from being understood, without intrusion, because when someone stops trying to decode every silence, stops asking for constant clarity, stops turning every moment into a conversation about where things are going, it creates a kind of emotional quiet that they're not used to. A quiet that feels safe. They don't feel watched. They don't feel analyzed. They don't feel like every word or lack of it is being measured for meaning. They're just allowed to exist in the connection without pressure to perform emotionally. And in that space, they begin to show more of them, not because they're asked to, but because they want to. They start opening up in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A thought shared without being prompted. A moment of vulnerability that slips through without overthinking. A piece of their internal world that they usually keep to themselves, slowly becoming visible. And what makes this different is that it's happening on their terms, at their pace, without being pulled or pushed in any direction. And that's what makes it real. Because when openness is forced, it feels unnatural to them, like they're being asked to skip steps in a process that needs time. But when it unfolds naturally, it feels safe enough to continue. And that safety builds something deeper than attraction. It builds trust. Not the kind that's spoken about, but the kind that's felt. The kind that forms quietly through consistent experience. Through moments where they expected pressure, but didn't find it. Through times where they created distance, and it wasn't taken personally. Through interactions where they were allowed to come and go without feeling like they were risking the entire connection. And over time, that consistency changes how they see you. You're no longer someone they have to be careful around. You're no longer someone they have to manage. You become someone they feel safe returning to. And that's when something else begins to take shape. A subtle sense of attachment, but without the usual fear that comes with it. They start thinking about you more. Not because you're constantly reaching out, but because your absence doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't carry pressure. It doesn't demand their attention. And that makes them want to give it freely. Because now, attention becomes a choice, not an obligation. And when something is chosen, it carries a completely different kind of weight. It feels genuine, intentional, real. But even here, there's a delicate balance. Because the moment this natural flow is interrupted by the need to define, secure, or accelerate the connection, everything shifts again. And it doesn't take much. Just a slight change in energy, a subtle push for clarity, a moment where curiosity turns into expectation. And suddenly, they feel it. That familiar tightening, that quiet awareness that something is being asked of them before they're ready to give it. And even if the intention behind it is completely valid, even if it comes from a place of wanting something real, it still triggers that same instinct to step back. Because for them, timing matters more than intensity. And when something moves faster than their internal process, it creates resistance. Not because they don't care, but because they need space to understand what they feel before they can express it. And when that space is taken away, even unintentionally, they lose that sense of safety, so they retreat. Not fully, but enough to create distance again. And this is where most people get confused. Because from the outside, it looks like inconsistency, like mixed signals, like someone who doesn't know what they want. But from the inside, it's simply a response to pressure. A way of restoring balance when things start moving too fast. And this is why quiet confidence becomes so powerful, even though it's often misunderstood. Because it's not about appearing distant or unaffected. It's about being grounded enough in yourself that you don't feel the need to control the pace of the connection. You don't rush to define it. You don't chase clarity the moment uncertainty appears. You don't try to secure something before it has naturally formed. Instead, you remain steady, present, certain in yourself even when the situation itself isn't fully clear. And that certainty creates something they're deeply drawn to, because it doesn't ask anything from them. It doesn't require them to match a certain level of expression. It doesn't make them feel like they need to step up or explain themselves before they're ready. It simply exists as a calm, stable presence in their life. And that presence becomes something they start to trust more than words. Because words can create pressure, but energy tells the truth. And when your energy remains consistent, when it doesn't shift based on their behavior, when it doesn't become reactive or uncertain, it sends a message they understand deeply, that you're not trying to control them, that you're not dependent on them for your emotional state, that you're choosing to be there, not needing to be. And that distinction changes everything. Because now the connection doesn't feel like something they might lose control over. It feels like something they can step into without losing themselves. And when that feeling settles in, even quietly, It begins to dissolve the very thing that usually makes them pull away. The fear of being consumed, the fear of being overwhelmed, the fear of not being able to meet expectations they never agreed to. And in its place, something new begins to form. A sense of ease, a willingness to stay, and a quiet, growing desire to move closer, not because they're being pulled, but because they finally feel safe enough to do it on their own. And when that sense of safety finally settles in, even if it's quiet, even if it's fragile at first, something begins to change in a way that feels almost unfamiliar to them. They start initiating. Not in a way that feels sudden or overwhelming, not in a way that completely shifts their personality overnight, but in small, meaningful ways that carry more weight than they seem to on the surface. A message they didn't have to send, but chose to. A moment of attention that lingers longer than usual. A check-in that isn't prompted by anything. Just a quiet thought of you that they decided to act on. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss it. You might overlook it because it doesn't look like the kind of effort you're used to. It's not loud, it's not constant, it doesn't come with big declarations or obvious signs. But for them, it's significant. Because every step forward they take is something they've thought about, something they've allowed themselves to feel comfortable with before acting on it. And that's what makes it real. It's not reaction, it's intention. And the more they experience that, the connection still feels safe, still feels unpressured, still allows them to be themselves without losing anything. The more those small steps begin to increase. Slowly, naturally, without being forced, they start showing up more consistently. They begin to engage a little deeper. They allow moments of closeness to last longer without interrupting them. And most importantly, they stop preparing themselves to leave. That quiet exit strategy that used to sit in the back of their mind slowly fades. Not because they've made a decision to stay forever, but because they no longer feel the need to protect themselves from something that doesn't feel threatening. And this is where the connection transforms into something deeper, something that isn't built on intensity, but on stability. Because intensity can create closeness quickly, but it often burns out just as fast. It overwhelms, it demands, it accelerates things before they've had time to settle into something real. But stability works differently. It builds slowly. It creates depth over time. It allows both people to remain themselves while still moving closer together. And for someone who has always been sensitive to losing themselves in connection, that kind of stability feels rare. It feels safe enough to trust. And when trust begins to form, they start letting you see parts of them that they usually keep hidden. Not all at once, not in a way that feels dramatic, but in moments. Fragments of vulnerability. Pieces of their thoughts that they don't normally share. Emotions that they've learned to process alone, now being expressed even if only slightly. And what matters most here isn't how much they open up. It's that they're choosing to, because for them, opening up isn't easy. It's not natural. It's something that requires a sense of safety that very few people ever create. And when they finally feel that safety, they don't take it lightly. They begin to value you in a way that goes beyond attraction, in a way that isn't based on what you do for them, but how they feel around you. Calm, unpressured, free, but still connected. And that combination is what makes you different. Because most people can create attraction. Most people can create moments of closeness. But very few can create a space where someone feels safe enough to stay without feeling like they're giving something up. And that's why these qualities are so rare. Because they require you to be something, not do something. To be grounded instead of reactive. To be understanding instead of intrusive. To be confident without needing constant reassurance. And that kind of presence can't be faked. It shows in how you respond to silence, in how you handle distance, in how you remain steady even when things aren't fully defined. And when someone experiences that consistently, it changes how they see you. You're no longer just someone they're interested in. You become someone they feel safe building something with, even if they don't say it right away, even if they take time to fully realize it themselves. The shift is already happening, and this is the part most people never reach. Because they try to force clarity before the connection has had time to develop naturally. They try to secure something that hasn't fully formed yet. They react to uncertainty instead of allowing it to unfold. And in doing that, they unintentionally push away the very thing they're trying to build. But when you move differently, when you allow things to develop at their own pace, when you don't let fear dictate your actions, something powerful happens. The connection becomes mutual, effort becomes balanced. And closeness becomes something that grows naturally instead of something that has to be chased. And that's when they stop running. Not because they've changed who they are, but because the connection no longer triggers the part of them that feels the need to escape. It feels safe. It feels steady. It feels like something they can be a part of without losing themselves in it. And that's all they've ever really needed. Not perfection. Not constant attention. Not overwhelming love. Just a connection that doesn't take more than it gives. A presence that doesn't pressure them to become someone else. A space where they can exist fully without feeling like they have to protect themselves from it. And when they find that, they don't walk away from it easily, because what you've created isn't just attraction, it's something deeper, something rare, something they don't come across often, and that's why they stay. Not because they have to, but because for the first time, they want to.